Now, if you remember last week, we're going to back up just a verse or two. You remember last week in Numbers chapter 11, we really talked about complaining, and that's what was Numbers 11, that section was about. And really, this is a continuation from it because we're picking up the very next verse. We're not going to cover all of chapter 11. We are going to skip one section to focus on another here in a moment. But in Numbers 11, if you remember previously backing up to about verse 13 or so, you remember this occasion where the people were giving into a craving. It wasn't that they were hungry. It wasn't that they were in need. They were wanting something else. And we talked about some reasons behind that, just some general unhappiness and not being satisfied and them being fickle and various things such as that. And in verse 13, and really I think it's previous to that as well, about verse 12 and following, we have Moses respond. He begins to complain to the Lord, but it's not about meat per se. I mean, he's not wanting the meat, but it's about the people, right? In verse 12, we're just going to read through this to verse 15. It says, "Did I conceive all these people? Did I beget them? That you should say to me, carry them in your bosom, as a guardian carries a nursing child to the land which he swore to their fathers. Where am I to get meat to give all these people? For they weep all over me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I am not able to bear all these people alone, because the burden is too heavy for me. If you treat me like this, I can still talk here, please kill me here and now if I have found favor in your sight, and do not let me see my wretchedness." And so clearly Moses is stressed. Moses is very much, you might say sometimes at the wit's end of dealing with these people. And I think about there in verse 12, or verse 13, rather, where he says, "For they weep all over me." You ever have your child who sometimes they kind of have a weepy, moany, crybaby day, and they just whine about everything? I think I'm the only one who's told my child, get off me, stop whining, stop complaining, just go do something, right? Now here in verse 13, that's really this similar idea. They're just weeping all over him, but these are grown adults. And their weeping is because they're wanting meat, not because they're actually in need. And then in verse 14 and 15, his complaint, you might say that's even more significant than dealing with the meat and these people, is that the burden of dealing with these people in general. And he says there, if you're going to treat me like this, I'll be better off if you just kill me here and now. Now in verse 16, where we're picking up today, you'll have the heading there, at least I'll be about the 70 elders, but 70 men are chosen to help Moses deal with these individuals. Now we understand, or hope we do, that God is helping Moses deal with these people, but he's going to send the people, not say, quote unquote, we say sometimes boots on the ground, feet on the ground kind of thing. 70 people are going to help him as well, 70 men. In verse 16, the Bible says, "The Lord said to Moses, gather to me 70 men of the elders of Israel, whom you know to be the elders of the people, and officers over them. Bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, they may stand there with you." Now, did God choose just anyone to serve? He didn't just say, you know what, you. No, he didn't do that. He picked here in verse 16 specific people. People, he says here in verse 16, he says, whom you know to be the elders of the people. Now, elders here in this context, and we're not talking like the same thing we're thinking of in the New Testament, but it is similar in the sense that they are to be leaders of the people. And we find here these are elders of the people in the sense that they are wise and they are able to give wise judgment. And we also know that God's going to do, as we find here in a moment, going to give them more than just that as well. Elders of the people and officers over them, bring them to the tabernacle of meeting, that they may stand there with you. Now notice verse 17. Then I will come down and talk with you there. There's a lot of verses in the Bible that stand out. I mean, more than we can think of probably. But that phrase, again, this is the Lord speaking to Moses. And there's a lot of times you find words of encouragement. I think sometimes we're not sure. We look over it because we just kind of look at it like this is the progression of what's going on. But the Lord is coming down. Look at verse 17. He says to talk with you there, the you there being Moses. Now we understand it's not literally God coming down in a figure of man and talking to him like we would someone today. But very much in a spiritual sense, yes, he is coming down. He's going to speak with him there. He's going to be present speaking to Moses. Now, Moses, as we know, had, he has spoken to God on more than one occasion, obviously, right? We talk about Moses and the burning bush and various things like that. But do you think there was some source or some sort of comfort knowing that, one, God heard Moses' prayer? We know that because he replied, and his answer implies that he heard his words. Do you think there's also another source of encouragement in verse 17 by him coming down and talking with him there? Well, yeah, right? I mean, if you think about it for a second, we try to encourage people today, and sometimes because of sickness, we're not able to be in person with people. But isn't being in person more encouraging than just a text or a call? And we understand those things have their place as well. But eye contact and seeing a person is very encouraging. Now, we understand Moses is not literally going to see God. The Bible tells us no one has seen God at any time. But he is going to be present there in the spiritual sense that he's going to be speaking to Moses. And the idea there being he is present with Moses during this time. And God has always been present during that time. But it shows a closeness, and it shows us a chance to find encouragement as Moses did. The Lord is with him in this, very close to him. You don't say, I'm going to come down and talk with you there if you're not intending to have a closeness with someone. And so you continue reading there. He says, he will come down and talk with you there. Verse 17, I will take the spirit that is upon you and put the same upon them. And they shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. Now, the Spirit can be a reference to, in verse 17, in the sense that the Spirit that was God going to give him some measure of the Holy Spirit. I think more aptly, what we're talking about here is they're going to have the same attitude and the same mindset of Moses. That they want to serve the Lord. They want to help the people get to where they're supposed to be going. I don't think we're talking about a miraculous type of thing here. I don't think that fits in context what we're talking about. But he's going to take his spirit, his mindset, his attitude of working for the Lord and wanting to do what is right for God and help lead these people. That's what he's going to put upon these men. He says, I'll put the same upon them. Now notice, is all the quote-unquote burden removed from Moses in verse 17? No, he doesn't get to go off and go on vacation, right? He doesn't get to say, hey, I'm going to go see the Red Sea for a while, come back in a month. No. He says in verse 17 here, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you. They're going to bear it together. Not take it all from him. They're going to bear it together. Shall bear the burden of the people with you, that you may not bear it yourself alone. And so the idea is not that Moses gets all of it relieved, and I don't think that's what Moses was thinking of when he was complaining that he wanted all the burden removed from him, but he wanted assistance with these people. He cannot bear it alone. And so you think about that, God does not completely relieve Moses from the sense of burden. Do you think it helped Moses to know the burden of the people firsthand? To hear the complaints, to hear their concerns, to see where they're struggling? I mean, that's a burden, right? I mean, we think about it this way. We're not talking about trying to carry a literal heavy load, but the idea being that he saw where they were strong, if you could find it, and you saw where they were weak. And because of who he was being a leader for God, it was a burden to him to see them struggling. I don't think Moses nor God wanted to see the people struggle. But when you complain about, if we're honest here, thinking about the meat and already being fed, were they complaining about a silly thing? In comparison to the big picture and where they're going, yes. And so the burden wasn't a literal weight, but it's that these people are struggling and it was wearing him out. Their complaint wasn't that God isn't with us. Their complaint was, we won't meet. And so they were complaining about things that were not as significant as the spiritual things, which nothing is as significant as spiritual matters. And so the Lord is going to bring these 70 people, these 70 elders here in verse 16. They're going to assist Moses. They're going to have the same spirit as him. They will share the burden with Moses together. Sometimes we look at the 70 people, and I've done this before, and say, well, that's a lot of burden. That's why I brought in 70 people. I think it's more the fact that, yes, there was a lot of burden, but there was a lot of people. And so what do you need? We need more people to help you guide them and deal with things that arise. And so that kind of gives us not just the idea of the burden, but really the massive amount of people we're talking about. Now, verses 16 and 17, so you have 70 men who God is going to come down and talk with Moses with him about them. They're in verse 17. They're going to assist him in bearing the heavy load. Now in verses 18 through 20, some titled this section 18 through 20, you shall eat meat or you will eat meat. God does, as we're going to see here in a moment, grant these people meat to eat. But we're going to see that, I think we mentioned this last time, is there a right way and a wrong way to go to God in prayer? You know, there's a right way and a wrong way to come to your parents to ask for something, right? And I mean, she's not in here, so I can say it. Sometimes my child will come to me and say something. I'll say, are you telling me or are you asking me? Because I think sometimes with Israel, you see them approaching God as if this is what we want, not a asking, this is what we like, if you know. And so there is a difference there in how we approach God. And God is responding. He's responding to Moses. Notice that between the people wanting meat and Moses going to God, who gets answered first? Moses. I don't think just because it's Moses, but because what the subject was. What was the issue? It was a spiritual thing. Your spiritual leader of the people is wearing out. The meat can wait, right? And so what do? You address Moses first, the spiritual leader. And so the spiritual response comes first above anything else. What does that tell us today? Are spiritual matters more important than the physical things? Definitely. Now, verses 18 through 20 says here, you shall say to the people, consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord, saying, who will give us meat to eat? For it was well with us in Egypt, therefore the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. So, verse 18, consecrate yourselves, prepare yourself, go, purify yourselves, right? The idea of going and getting ready, getting clean, doing all those types of things to go along with consecrating yourselves for a feast, because that's what we're talking about here. And you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the hearing of the Lord. It wasn't, he doesn't say that you have requested. He doesn't say that you have need of. He just says you wept. It doesn't really does it seem to imply that God is actually happy with how they requested this? Because it wasn't really, I guess it was a request, but was he happy with how they went about it? He didn't say you do what?
It's like my mama telling me, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah. And we know as we continue to go through it, God does do that in a moment. But he gives them to them because they're weeping, they're complaining. But it's not the same as we're going to see here in a moment, it's not the same as you're crying here, take this, just be quiet, and then going on. Because he gives them what they want, but then they don't respond like they should. And what happens? God responds, not say for their non-response, and for their request and their whining. So verse 18, therefore the Lord will give you meat and you shall eat. Verse 19, you shall eat not 1 day, not 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but for a whole month. You think back when you were younger, you ever had that vegetable you put on your plate, that your parents put on your plate, so you have to eat that amount? And sometimes we might complain, what would happen? The amount, I don't know about you, but in my house, the amount never got smaller. It got larger. I've seen my brothers watch my dad take a pan of whatever it was, push it across and say, now you can eat the whole thing, because they were whining and complaining. Well, in verses 19 and 20, it's not, okay, we'll give it to you 1 day, not 2 days. It's verse 20 says, for a whole month. They were sick of the manna. I mean, that's what their attitude was. Now they're going to be sick of the meat. But as we continue reading, we're going to find they really don't even go that far. They don't get to that point before God begins to pour out his wrath upon them. So he says, you'll have it not 1 day, 2 days, 5 days, nor 10 or 20, but for a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils and becomes loathsome to you, because ye have despised the Lord who's among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever come up out of Egypt? God was making a very big point here, wasn't he? Can God provide meat? Now remember, this is a massive amount of people. We're not talking about 5 or 10 or even thousands. We're talking possibly hundreds of thousands of people here. And there's so much meat for all these people that he says here in verse 20, it's going to come out of your nostrils and become loathsome to you. You're going to hate it because there's going to be so much of it. Why? Because they were complaining. The amount is based upon their complaining. It's going to come out. It's going to be everywhere. It's all you're going to see. He says, because you have said before him, saying, why did we ever come up out of Egypt? Because they didn't have trust in God is what they're being punished for, right? They're saying they're looking backwards. You know, we had this and this in Egypt, completely forgetting they were slaves, they were in bondage. You know, in the New Testament, Christ, when speaking about those who want to be followers of him, tells us we cannot look back. No one having put his hand to the plow can look back is fit for the kingdom of God. Now we understand this is Old Testament, but could they successfully see the promised land if they're still looking back in Egypt and all the leeks and cucumbers and all that stuff? No, their mind wasn't where it needed to be. And that's what, I think that's another point we find here in verse 20 is they're still looking back. They're still remembering all the quote food, the good things, right? But they're forgetting a lot of what else was in Egypt, right? They never mentioned all the hard labor they had. They never mentioned the bricks where they had to go and find straw, then later had to go and build bricks without straw whatsoever. They never mentioned the hard times they faced under Pharaoh. They just remembered the food. And so God here is punishing them for having this attitude of just continually looking back. Now, in 18 through 20, God says he's going to give them food, right? He's going to give them so much, or give them meat, and so much so it's going to come out of their nostrils. Now, if you drop down in the same chapter, drop all the way down to verse 31, and look what happens here. Now a wind went out from the Lord, and it brought quail from the sea. You ever had quail before? I've had it a handful of times. You remember, it's a bony little bird. There's a lot of bones in it, and I've only had it once, but I remember that. It was good, but it took forever to get it off all that. And I kind of think, to me, in my mind, I think this might have been another way to try to punish them. Here's your meat, but you're going to do what? You're going to sit there and just pull it all off the bone. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to be just it's not going to be like, carving the turkey at Thanksgiving, right? And so he brings out the quail here in verse 31. He brought out quail from the sea and left them fluttering near the camp, about a day's journey on this side and about a day's journey on the other side, all around the camp, and about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. That is a lot of bird. Now, if you're a quail hunter, you'd say jackpot, right? I mean, they're just fluttering there. Look how many there is. Just start shooting. And so there's a little bit of ease for them to get it because it's all around them. But they do have to travel a day's journey, right? There in verse 20, or verse 31 rather. He says there in verse 31, he left them fluttering near the camp about a day's journey. I like how a day's journey is near the camp.
I think that talking about that it was a span of a day's journey out.
Yeah.
The quail was all the way out a day's journey.
Yeah.
Not that they were out a day's journey, but that is the span of the quail.
The span of the quail? Okay. So that's that much of them. Okay.
Well, you mentioned in Numbers chapter 1, it was, I forget the exact number, but it's 600,000 toward the end of the chapter there, of men that could go to war. Well, if you take that 600,000, and it seems like it's 630,000 or something like that, I don't remember the exact number. But if you take that 600,000 men that can go to war And then you take those that were under that age and those that were over that age, and then consider the fact that that's talking about men. We're talking about a congregation of well over 1 million people. It takes a lot of quail.
Yeah.
And so, you need that day's span of quail all the way around the camp
Yeah.
to feed that number of people. And like you said, I mean, well, my cousins always breasted the quail when they shot it.
Mhm.
We didn't do that, but they always breasted it. But the only thing that's really worth eating is the breast and the leg, the top part of the leg.
Yeah.
And, I mean, you can eat a lot of quail.
Yeah, there's not much to them.
Of course, that's thinking that that quail is the same as our quail,
Yeah.
which, I mean, that quail may have been bigger or something like that.
Yeah.
Who knows?
Chapter 1, verse 46, were 603,550.
So I
So,
got three in there somewhere.
Yeah. So yeah, the 600, well, it's like when we talk about the
And
feeding
the
of
previous verse tells you that it's.
yeah. And it's like the feeding of the 4,000 and 5,000. That's only the men, doesn't include the women and the children.
Exactly.
So yeah, could easily be a million people or more. And which, again, think about if the quail filled a day's journey and then floating above the ground, and like Chuck was saying, like I remember as well, it's not a big bird. It's going to take a lot of quail to feed that many people. I mean, you go back here, verse 31, about 2 cubits above the surface of the ground. A cubit is roughly about 18 inches. So was about a little over 3 feet above the ground. That's a lot of bird to be floating around. And you think about it that way, if they're all around you, the Bible says they're on this side and that side. Birds aren't quiet. You can't imagine the noise as well when you got up and went outside and here's your quail, and there's just everywhere. Which really goes right along what we talked about a moment ago, right? How he says it's going to come out of their nostrils. There's something loathsome to them. But you continue reading here.
Well, could you imagine? I mean, if you've ever cleaned quail, I mean, there is as much waste as there is
Yeah.
as their meat to eat. So, I mean, when you're talking about coming out of the nostrils, you're talking about all that stuff besides the meat that you can actually eat and that kind of thing. I mean, it's just unbelievable.
Yeah. And it makes you think about, did God give them their meat? Yes. Quail probably wasn't what they had in mind. I mean, I don't know. But again, that massive amount of people, that much quail, like Chuck and I was saying, the size of it and how much you can actually get out of it, and all those people, really helps us understand the idea of it coming out of your nostrils. So there's a lot of birds, and then you have all the stuff from, like you said, from cleaning it, all that nasty stuff.
It's a lot of feathers.
Yeah. Verse 32 says here, and the people stayed up all that day, all night, and all the next day, and gathered the quail. He who gathered least gathered 10 homers. Now, a homer here, I never can remember what all these terms or the measure of it. Homer, unit of dry measure about 65 imperial gallons. So, okay, a lot of quail, right? Now, he says here, gathered least, gathered 10 homers. Now, you think about that for a moment. It's all out there. All the birds are out. What you wanted is there. You go out and you gather a ton of it, and it takes them all day, all night, all the next day. That is a long time just to get birds. We're not even talking about eating them yet. We're talking about just gathering them up, right? They gather them, they spread them out for themselves all around the camp. Verse 33, here's the problem. But while the meat was still between their teeth, between 32 and 33, what do you notice that is missing? Thanks, right? Did someone else say something? Gratitude, yeah. There's no pausing. I mean, he gives them more than enough, obviously. They go out, they just have to gather it up. and they're eating, and there's no stopping to give thanks. Because remember, Moses said, where am I going to get the meat to feed all of these people? Well, it had to come from God. And so when you come out and you see the quail all around, literally almost stacked up upon themselves, and takes you all day, all night, all the next day to gather it up, and then you start to eat, and it's all focused on self, isn't it? Let's just clean it and let's get all this out so we can clean it and start eating as quick as we can, because that's all they clearly thought about, right? There was no pausing to thank God for this. Among the meat was still between their teeth before it was chewed. It means, they just take a bite and there's no, you think about it, it takes a few chews probably for you get to really enjoy whatever the flavor is. And they get a bite, and he says in verse 33, before it was chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against the people, and the Lord struck the people with a very great plague. Now, the Bible does not say what that plague is. The Lord used all kinds of things. We think about all the different plagues we've seen in the Bible. You think about, these people had seen plagues in Egypt, hadn't they? And so a plague could literally be, because God we understand, can do literally anything. We have no idea what it was, but it was a form of punishment. So whatever that plague was, it was a form of punishment. And I am sure that none of us want a part of that. And so while they have taken a bite before it's chewed, the wrath of the Lord was aroused against them, against the people. The Lord struck the people with a very great plague, not just something where, hey, my mouth is sore. It's a very great plague. It implies, at least in my mind, that people, as we're going to see here in a moment, that people are going to die because of their actions. So he called the name of that place Kibroth Hattaavah, because there they buried the people he had yielded to craving. There they buried the people. They died over meat. They died over ingratitude. They died over complaining about things that did not matter because they were already being fed. They died for a selfish reason, didn't they? And so we think about that today. In a real sense, from Numbers 11, can selfishness kill? Yeah, it killed them. Now,
Well, interesting, Kibroth Hattaavah means grave of greed.
yeah, graves of lust, graves of greed. Yeah, I just happened to tap it. Yeah. I love those names. Like we'll talk about Zechariah tonight. The names of places, names of people. What a great, I say that kind of sheepishly, what a great name for a place of people who died because of their lust for something else. You think about that today, they already had what they needed, but they wanted something else. Can you apply that in other areas of life that cause people to sin? Married people are married to have a spouse, and then they want something else, and we can see that all across the board, right? People have, again, you can apply it a lot of different ways where we are being satisfied, but we want something else or something different. And here with the people in Numbers 11, they had food. They had the ability to make this man into all types of different things. They wanted something else. And the end result is they are buried in a place, like Chuck pointed out there, which means the graves of lust or the graves of greed. Either one would fit, right? That their end result is they're buried. They died. They were struck with this great plague, and they ended up dying because of that. And so, people keep saying people. The world around us sometimes today will talk about how the Bible is outdated and how it doesn't apply to us today. We can't learn anything from it. And I just can't think, what book are you reading?
They're not reading it.
Well, that's part of it, yeah. Because they read things like, the craving. They just wanted meat. Well, how many times people today want something when they already have have what they need, but they want something different. What happens? It causes them to be put in a very, very bad place. Here it costs them their life. And so we still find lessons from all the way, throughout the Bible, obviously, but all the way back in Numbers, people who are trying to get to the promised land, and they're still dying for they were dying for some of the same reasons people today are in their sins and dying for. They want something different. They've lost sight of what is important, right? We've heard people say, and I've said this before, and it's easy to say, it's much more difficult to do sometimes, that we lose sight of the simple things. All these people had to do was go out, grind up that manna if they wanted to, and bake different things with it. And one of the things they said, the Bible says that they could bake cakes with it. I like cake. She's already laughing already. But there's a lot of things that can cause us to lose sight of what is important, right? These people lost sight of it, and it's sad that their end result is, well, how did they die? Well, they gave in to craving meat when they already had been fed food from God. Well, that's not very smart. No, it's not. Let's go back to Numbers chapter 11.
Russ,
Yes.
I think about it with the church, with religious groups. It's like we have the Bible, we have everything we need, but people want more and they want to add to it. And they add to it until it's not recognizable, it's not the church. And one day, the wrath is going to be kindled against them.
Yeah.
God sent them quail in that situation to appease them. In the church, they get sent preachers that are willing to itch their ears and carry them off in sin. And then one day, they're going to face judgment.
Yeah, the give the people what they want thing, or wanting something different, like you were saying. Yeah, it applies definitely to that as well. You think about, the Old Testament, they wanted kings, right? We know how well that worked out for them. People in the New Testament, Paul, we write to Timothy, how there are those, like Chris was mentioning, he wants someone to scratch their itching ears. That means they want to hear something different. They want to hear something that's going to soothe them. And they got what they wanted, but it comes at a cost, right? It came at a cost in Numbers 11. It came at a cost later in the New Testament. It comes at a cost still today. The cost we see today around us a lot is we have division after division after division. And it causes people to say, why are there so many churches? And so there's a lot of problems with failing to realize where we currently are, what we actually need, and what can cause us to sin. And in Numbers 11, the reason for sin was they were failing to realize they were being fed from God. And they kind of treated God like they're genie. This is what we want now. And so they were punished for it. Just so many different things went wrong in Numbers 11, which is really kind of pushes you towards the idea of why Moses said what he did. I need some help, because these are the type of people he's dealing with. They're willing to sin and to die because they want meat. And Moses was trying to get them just remain faithful to God to get to the promised land, which, if you remember, the promised land was a place described as a land flowing with milk and honey, which is a reference to an abundance of all types of things. And he just had to get them there. It sounds, you think, oh, you just had to get them there. Again, like Chuck pointed out with Numbers 11, we're talking about a lot of people, a massive amount of people. Getting them to have the same mind and get to the promised land. You think when Moses started, I think God, knew this as well, that people are going to die along the way. Yeah. Because mankind has free will, we can choose. When people are talking about, some people are chosen, some people are not. These people were God's chosen people in Numbers 11, right? And they still chose to complain against God and go to the grave over meat. It's very discouraging to think about some of the things that people will dig their heels in about. And Numbers 11 is about the meat. We want meat. We're weeping. We're crying. Moses said there in Numbers 11 that there was people crying out throughout all the camp. That's a whole lot of weeping, a whole lot of crying. And no wonder Moses said, just kill me. This is how it's going to be. Obviously, I don't think he really wanted to die, but he wanted some serious help. We're going to jump ahead. Are there any comments or questions before we move ahead? But we are going to move ahead to Numbers 12. Yeah.
I think if we're not careful, we can very quickly lose sight, get caught up in all the things and lose sight of what God, the lengths that He's gone through for us to have salvation.
Yeah, definitely. That's an excellent point. Because you think about, like you brought up, bringing them out of Egypt, that was a huge ordeal. I mean, he could have just wiped out, Pharaoh and brought them all out. But each plague, we talked about this before, was designed to show God's power over all their different false gods. If you go back and look at that, it's the attack against all their false gods. And it shows God's power, and then he brings them out. But that is a long time. There's a lot of things that transpired. It's easy to say, well, God performed 10 plagues and then he brought them out. He did incredible things within all those plagues, within all those things, showing his power over the land, over the creatures, over the universe, on and on the list goes. And then he brings them out. And you kind of think about it this way, what does he get in return? Not quite what he deserves. Right? I mean, let's understand, not everybody was acting this way. I don't think, at least my viewpoint, you ever see a time where the entire congregation literally was against him. But there was massive groups, right? I mean, Numbers 11 starts off that there was burnings on the outskirts of the camp, which means there were some who were not doing what was right. We mentioned before how if we didn't change, it probably would have continued on. But he brings them out of Egypt. He provides this place. Think about how good does a place have to be for it to be labeled the Promised Land? I mean, I joke about going to a restaurant and saying it's the Promised Land. It's a joke. It's not the Promised Land. But we think about where they were going. It was a place where they were not going to have to worry about food, which obviously they had a concern about. They were going to have protection. I mean, find throughout, as we look at Joshua as well, where the idea was no one can stand against you. Moses was leading them, then Joshua, to get them to the Promised Land. And the whole time they're being provided for by God, literally being led day and night, right? No one can stand against you. Just stick with me, and they can't do it. Now, it sounds simple when we say it that way, right? When we say it that way, right? Just stick with me. I'll guide you day and night, the pillar of cloud, the smoke, the food, Moses, and then Joshua, and nobody can stand against you. That means you will conquer any enemy you face. Just stick with me. Be loyal, be faithful to God, and he will get you to the Promised Land. And going the whole way, God going through, like Shirley was saying, these great lengths to do things. You think about just the Exodus out of Egypt, that's an incredible thing to take place. You think about, you go back further than that, go back to Noah in the days of the flood. That's some great lengths to save. We say sometimes, well, just to save 8 people. No, it was to save mankind. Because without 8 people, there would be no mankind. God had to start all over. And so he saved those 8 people by water, the Bible tells us, goes through great lengths, floods the entire world. That's not a small thing to do. I can't do it. And he cleanses the world, brings out Noah and his family. We find that starting point from then on. And then he leads us up to eventually to Exodus with the people and with Moses. And then we find ourselves here not too far removed from those events. And they're still having some of the same problems, short-sightedness. If you go back to Exodus to, again, talk about Shelley's point, having a short memory, Moses on the top of the mountain with God, right? Not the first time he was, quote, with God, getting the 10 Commandments. And he was up there, I think a lot of historians and things will say approximately 30 days, which really isn't that long. I'm just going to ballpark that and say 30 days. And the Bible says there in Exodus, I believe it's, I forget the chapter now, maybe it's 3, where they come to Aaron complaining and they want him to make a golden calf for them to worship because they say, we don't know what happened to this man Moses. What do you think bad will happen to Moses on the top of the mountain with God? No. If something bad was going to happen to a faithful servant of God, it wouldn't be while he was with God alone on the top of the mountain. And what happens? They show their short-sightedness, don't they? If it was 30 days, as some say, that's not very long, is it? They forget about coming across, it would seem, about coming across the Red Sea, right? They forget about coming out of Egypt. They forget about all those things to the point they say, make us a golden calf, right? We talked about that last week when we talked about the lesson on bravery and the things that went on there. But again, we get to Numbers 11, now Numbers 12. We find here, if you remember Numbers 12, do you remember what happens in Numbers 12? Surprise, surprise, people sent in opposition to Moses, which is a form of complaining. And we've talked about this before, how Israel kind of goes like this with their faithfulness, like a roller coaster. But if we're not careful, we're the same way. We can allow ourselves to get upset about something, or something that bothers us in our everyday life, and our faith can kind of dip a little bit. And that's not uncommon, but we have to find a way to respond to it. With Moses and people of Israel, their way to respond we really would like some meat. We really kind of get down right now. That might help morale or something. You don't hear that. It's just weeping, complaining, and crying the whole time. And so we have to decide how we're going to respond to times of weakness, times of stress, times of low morale. And Israel, and definitely Numbers 11, was not an example for that. Okay, I've talked too much. We're about out of time. So we're going to wait till next week. We'll pick up in Numbers 12, 1 through 16. I was trying to catch us up, but that's not going to happen today, and that's okay. So any other comments or questions today? All right, then we're going to stop there, and we'll pick up next week in Numbers chapter 12.